preserve, the word preserve, is a combination of two old words, pre, before, serve, to serve. So when we think of preserve, normally we just think of like, okay, you set something aside, it's kind of passive, you've got that jar of jelly in your refrigerator, your preserves, maybe you have a book that's been preserved or art that's been preserved or something like that, and you just kind of set it aside for any kind of use. It's not an active thing. But what I'm hoping is that we can think about it as being more active and more something that we can be involved in every day, really, including our lives here, especially in Illinois. So, what do we preserve? When do we do preserving? That will probably be obvious from what I just said. How does preservation occur of the sort that I'm talking about, the what that I'll be getting into, and then why, and for whom should preservation or preserving or preserving who are we going to serve in that context? So one of my favorite product labels I have ever seen was when I got to my stage of having a midlife crisis, got my first motorbike, learned how to ride the motorbike. I sit down on the motorbike, and right there in the gas tank is this dictum, this command: preserve nature on the gas tank, petrol tank of my motorbike. I thought, well, that's pretty cool. This must be the bike for me because I'm a preservationist. The thing that I like to preserve isn't necessarily art or jams and jellies, although I've done that, but nature, wilderness. So Honda might have meant by preserve nature, given that they paired this with a message about wearing a helmet and thinking about safety, it might have simply meant don't die. But I figured I would go with the interpretation that said we should actually preserve nature, and that I should be continuing the struggle to preserve nature in wild places. This was back home in the United States, but now that I'm here in South and Southeast Asia, continue doing the same thing, preserving nature. And in particular, the kind of nature that most interests me is wilderness, the parts of the landscape, the parts of our world that are the most wild, the most free of human intervention, although these days almost no place is with climate change and other things. But, so another conveyance, not taken in a seasonally appropriate time, but my snowshoes tell me seek wilderness. So get on the motorbike, preserve nature, get on my snowshoes, and seek wilderness. Now, in the words of the Wilderness Act, what wilderness is nature that is untrammeled by human beings. A trammel is a device that you would use if you're trying to manage livestock that prevents that horse, that sheep, that cow from moving anywhere. Like I used to raise sheep, and a trammel would have gone over the sheep's neck, the front feet would have gone into this thing, would be completely immobilized on the ground, unable to get away, unable to exercise any sort of free will. Wilderness, by contrast, is untrammeled by the hand of man. It is left to be its own, it's set aside and left to be its own wild nature. So that's a particular kind of nature preservation that interests me the most. And when we do that, preserve has to occur before the use of the wilderness or the nature itself. This scene here that we're seeing is the signing of the Wilderness Act of 1964. Lyndon Johnson, I understand, is not very popular around these parts for a lot of good reasons, but he did some good stuff, like signing the Voting Rights Act, signing the National Land and Water Conservation Fund, and signing the Wilderness Act. You hear a couple of other heroes from the U.S. wilderness preservation movement, Marty Murie, over here, Howard Zahniser's widow. He had died just before this was signed. Howard Zahniser was the man who wrote the act and lobbied over 11 years for its passage. And what the Wilderness Act does is sets up a system that preserves nature, or by which we can preserve nature for the future. So we have the law in place, we can protect something, preserve something in advance of its being used. Going a little farther back, and actually the model for the U.S. National Wilderness Preservation System comes from the Adirondack Park in the state of New York, the province of New York. And there, they actually amended their constitution in the 1890s so that the lands owned by the state that were forested would be in this forest preserve lands. No trees would be cut, there would be no permanent development, there would be basically letting nature have its own way, and then having the value of that available for the people of the state and the people of the rest of the country. But, 1964, when I was a baby, 1892, way longer ago than that, that's really kind of just the beginning. Because in my view, as far as I know, those legal protections are fairly recent. The origin of the idea that people should be preserving nature goes all the way back to the beginning of human history. In fact, you can actually argue, or I would argue, that the whole point of our species' purpose, or the whole point of our species' existence on this planet, is to preserve nature, to serve nature. In the Latin here, this is from the book of Genesis in the Bible, we've got this voluptuous paradise. I love this phrasing here in the Vulgate translation. This voluptuous paradise that we were to keep and to serve for all time. And then, man was put in the garden to keep it and to serve it. And as far as I can tell, in my faith tradition anyway, there is no other indication of why our species exists, why are we on the planet, except to preserve nature. So that's why we're supposed to be doing preservation. Now, I'll go to that point. Now we could actually have a whole other talk on how that command, how that purpose has gone off the rails and why we're in some of the conditions we are now, but that would be a whole different talk. We don't have time for that today. But what if, because God told me to do this, is not sufficient for you? What if it's completely irrelevant, but you don't believe in God? Why else? Why would we preserve nature? And I think we also do it for ourselves, for our current selves and for our future selves. We do it because we learn a lot from nature. We learn about our nature from what we see in the external nature, in the environment. So this Lewis Fork Wilderness, going back to the Wilderness Act, the means of protecting that, the means of preserving that, was established in 1964. In 1983, in 1964 I was still wearing diapers, as I said. 1960. By 1983, I'm rocking the Daisy Dukes, and I'm on spring break with my buddy John Shuck over here, and we went backpacking in the Lewis Fork Wilderness. And at that point in my life, I kind of thought I had it all figured out. I was king of my own little universe, second yearman in college. I was doing my little thing, again, I thought I had it all figured out. But I get to the wilderness, and it put me in a place physically, and it put me in a place mentally, it put me in a place spiritually, where I could actually think about things differently, because I was exposed to this nature that was wild, this nature that had been preserved for me by people who never knew of my existence. So I got back from spring break. I realized I needed to change up some things in my life, and I needed to do some preserving of my own. So I got back to school, made some of those changes, continue to make some of those changes 35, 40 years later, and have actually entered into a career of continuing the work of preserving nature. A little bit farther on, by 1990, I was day hiking with my daughter on the Appalachian Trail, which is a 2,100 mile, figure out what that is in kilometers, but 2,100 mile footpath from the state of Maine to the state of Georgia, originally conceived of in 1921, and it started to be preserved in 1925. And the work to preserve it continues today. It's a continued action on the part of the Appalachian Trail Conservancy and many other volunteers to do that work. But the preservation that happened starting in 1921 by Benton Mackay and other people was for the benefit of me and my daughter, 68 years later. And we do the preservation now for the benefit of our children, our grandchildren, future generations, people whom we will never know or hear about. But that's another just indication that in order for the benefits to occur later on, the preservation needs to happen now. We have to serve pre-use, okay, to pre-serve nature. Now, why else would we do this besides our own enjoyment, besides for our own children and our grandchildren? Well, we can do it to repulse tyranny. Bob Marshall, who was one of the founders of the Wilderness Society, said that the only, it's hard to read here, the only hope of repulsing the tyrannical ambition of civilization to conquer every inch on the whole earth is the organization of spirited people who will fight for the freedom and the preservation of wilderness. And this a photograph is on my wall of the offices of the Wilderness Society in Washington, D.C., and I got to see this every day for a while, so it would be ongoing inspiration to continue the work to preserve nature. Another reason is that it saves the whole world. Henry David Thoreau said that in wildness, in that wild nature, that's where we're actually going to get the salvation of the entire world. Protecting nature for its own sake, but also protecting nature for our sake. We also preserve it for ecological integrity. That's what we hear about a lot. Oftentimes it's important to make an argument to policymakers, to decision makers, that preserving nature is going to result in saving a species in particular, or saving economic value, or making sure that we have clean water and clean air and so forth. This group of folks is my former staff at the Wilderness Society. This was the Ecology and Economics Research Department. So we had about a third of us were working on the economic issues. What does wilderness do for people economically? Other people were working on ecological questions. How does wilderness protection save migratory songbirds? Or how does it save elk? Or how does it save grizzly bears? Or how does it save polar bears? All of that sort of work. And the other third were computer mappers, remote sensing and GIS folks. As I learned in that effort too, I came into this work sort of with degrees in economics and environmental economics, thinking, well, this was a scientific endeavor. But I also found that a big reason for doing the work is that it's just a whole lot of fun. You're doing work that's meaningful, that's for the future, and you're doing it with people that you love. So having the opportunity to do that, to be part of a bigger story with your companions is pretty important stuff. Getting a little bit closer to home, Zip here is the owner of Keep Illinois Clean. Yeah, well, yes, but also a huge dynamo of effort behind it. But we preserve nature because we care about, we love that particular place. And Keep Illinois Clean's trash picking up efforts really, exemplifies that. And you might think, well, okay, picking up trash, how is that preserving? Because you're not doing anything to preserve the environment. But sometimes you first have to restore something to its health before you can preserve it for the future. And that's what Keep Illinois Clean is doing here too. So maybe restore needs to be a theme in another future Creative Mornings. Another reason to do it is because you love the people who depend on that place. Such as, for example, a recent effort by the Center for Development and Integration, who did a run and a trash cleanup and a drinking water well drilling. Is that right? You were there, right?
Yeah.
So Ryan was there. Ryan's an intern at CDI. And you preserve the nature because there are people who live there, who know the place, who love the place, who depend on the place, who need that nature for their own health, for their own sanity, for their own survival. So this is Abenmachon. So these little girls will have a cleaner environment as a result of the work that CDI did to preserve nature out there. And their children and their children's children, hopefully. But why else do we do it? Sometimes it just seems hopeless. And to me, preserving nature is fundamentally an act of hope. And it's important to exercise that, to take those actions, to do that preservation, even when there seems to be no hope at all. I've been in this work of preserving nature for more than 30 years now. And as we often say in the environmental community, all victories are temporary, all defeats are permanent. And I really think that's true. And you look at situations like what we have now, all the things that can undo preservation of nature, undo preservation of wilderness. It's an uphill slog to begin with, but then we get, bad policy. We get bad economics. We get junk science, climate change denial. We get all of the other bad sides of human nature that result in destruction of rainforests, for example, replacing orangutan habitat with palm plantations so that we can have tastier candy and so forth. Back home this would probably resonate more, but Trump happens. Things change. It gets more difficult to preserve nature over time. And yet, even so, even in the face of seeming hopelessness, there's that guidance. There's the gas tank on my motorcycle, preserve nature. There's the book of Genesis, serve and keep nature, preserve nature. We're not to serve and keep nature when it's convenient or until it gets difficult, or when somebody is going to recognize what we've done, like by putting them in a slideshow, for example, or when it means we're not going to have to make any changes in our lives, like when we go back to school at the end of spring break, or when we go out today and we decide whether or not to buy that Kit Kat bar. We don't preserve nature just when it's easy, just when it's convenient. In fact, we just preserve nature because. Now, some of our four-legged brothers and sisters do not have a voluptuous garden to live in. In fact, like these guys at the Center of Pet Animal Protection Studies have a rundown villa that they live in all the time. But some of my heroes currently in nature preservation are the young men and women who started this organization and who operate it every day. I just show up once a week and do a little bit of work with them. But they have provided an oasis of nature, in the midst of this city for dogs and cats who would otherwise have no hope, for whom preservation of what, would be seemingly hopeless. So this little frightened dog suffered from who knows how many months or how many years of neglect and abuse that brought him to this point of having diseases, a couple of different kinds of mange. He really looked like a hopeless case. There is nothing about this dog right here that screams, take me home to your garden, right? He seemed to have no wildness left in him. He was simply a bundle of the effects of bad human behavior on him, bad human nature on him. And I figured he would most likely just live out his life, most likely a short one, in this rundown villa. And I knew, or I thought I knew, that I was bathing him and trimming his nails for a future that he would never see. I was wrong, of course. Like the 40 or so other dogs at the shelter, like the fields and trails in Oakland, like the streets and waterways of Hanoi, he was still part of a wild nature that was worthy of preserving, and that we are compelled, required, or expected to serve, to preserve it. So we act on the hope. We serve nature for a future that we cannot see, and that alone can be good for the soul, regardless of what we think the outcome would be. However, it's also pretty sweet when you get to see the future when it occurs. So it can happen. It can work out really well. Same dog. Let's take another look. Before, after. Dog gets a forever home. So I always get choked up with the dogs. So what do? You do your part to preserve nature. Yes, of course, you should skip the straw. You should get your refill Hanoi water bottle. You should stop with the plastic bags already. Maybe think twice about that Kit Kat bar on your way home today. But I suggested that you go a little bit deeper. Find out how to help here at home in Hanoi. CPAPs, Keep Hanoi Clean, other groups that are doing this great work. Get involved with them. Get your hands dirty. Get your heart broken. Do the work to preserve nature and become part of a bigger story. Fight tyranny. And most of all, have it be. Thank you.